sometimes the greatest gift you can receive is also the greatest curse. And few understand this truth better than a small flower Pokemon who never asked for what she was given. Before we dive into this story, I want you to think about something. Imagine you had a friend, someone you loved deeply, and they gave up everything to save you, but in doing so, they destroyed countless others. Would you stay? Could you forgive them? And if that gift they gave you meant you could never die, never age, never join the natural cycle of life that every other creature follows, would you still call it a gift? This is the story of Floette, not just any Floette, but the Eternal Flower Floette, Azzy's partner, a Pokemon who's been walking this earth for 3,000 years. 3,000 years of memories, 3,000 years of loneliness, 3,000 years of carrying the weight of an energy that killed thousands of her own kind. And in all that time, she never once evolved, never once found peace. She just existed, frozen in a moment that should have been her death, but became her eternity. What does it mean to live forever when you're not meant to? What does it feel like to be a living weapon, a monument to tragedy, when all you ever wanted was to hold a flower and dance in the sunlight? Let's talk about that. But first, if you're enjoying this kind of deep dive into Pokemon lore, the kind of stories that keep you thinking long after the video ends, consider leaving a like. And if you want more explorations like this, stories that go beyond the surface of these games we love, subscribe, because there's so much more darkness hiding in the light of the Pokemon world. Now, let's go back to the beginning, 3,000 years ago, to a war that nobody today even remembers the reason for. The Kalos region 3 millennia in the past was a very different place. A king named AZ ruled the land, a towering figure who united the region through technology and innovation, unlike anything seen in that era. He was gifted, brilliant, and he had a companion, a small Floette, passed down to him from his late mother. It wasn't just any Floette. The flower she carried was unique, an eternal flower, something that no longer blooms anywhere in the modern world. The petals were black and red, like the colors of war and blood, though at the time, they represented nothing so sinister. She was small, delicate, the kind of Pokemon that existed to bring beauty to the world, to nurture flowers, to dance in fields where sunlight filtered through trees. Floette are caretakers by nature. They draw out the hidden power of flowers, tend to wilting blossoms, celebrate when gardens bloom. They're gentle creatures, peaceful, the kind of Pokemon you'd never imagine on a battlefield. But war doesn't care about what you were meant to be. When the conflict erupted between Kalos and a neighboring region, a war whose origins have been lost to time, but whose brutality is still written in the land. Pokemon weren't partners, they were tools, weapons, resources to be exploited, gathered, and deployed by whoever had the power to command them. Pokemon with special abilities were especially prized, treated as living artillery, shields, instruments of destruction. And AZ's Floette, despite being a creature of flowers and gentleness, was taken from him, forced into service, sent to fight in a war she had no part in creating. Think about that for a moment. You're a Floette. Your entire existence revolves around nurturing life. You care for flowers, you celebrate growth, you exist in harmony with the natural world, and suddenly, you're on a battlefield, surrounded by chaos, violence, death. Pokemon screaming, falling, bleeding. The ground scorched, the sky dark with smoke. Everything you were meant to protect, destroyed. Everything you represented, meaningless in the face of human greed and rage. How long did she fight? Days, weeks, months? The war dragged on for what some sources suggest was nearly a century of on and off conflict. How many battles did this small flower Pokemon survive? How many times did she watch other Pokemon fall beside her? How many times did she look across the battlefield and wonder, why? Why was she here? What purpose did her existence serve in this place of death? And then, it ended, for her at least. Several years after being taken from AZ, a box arrived, a tiny coffin. Inside, the flower she had carried. Nothing more, just the flower, no body, no farewell, just the proof that she was gone. AZ, the king of Kalos, the man who had united his region through brilliance and innovation, received that box and collapsed. Grief unlike anything he'd ever known consumed him. This wasn't just a Pokemon. This was a gift from his mother, who had also passed. This was his companion, his friend, a piece of his family, and she'd been taken from him, sacrificed to a war he hadn't even started, used as a tool by people who saw her as nothing more than expendable. But AZ was a genius, and grief can drive a genius to do terrible things. He decided he would bring her back, no matter what it took. So he built a machine, a massive crystalline device shaped like a flower, mirroring the very eternal flower that Floette had carried. This wasn't just technology. This was something that touched on the fundamental forces of life and death in the Pokemon world. The machine's purpose was singular and absolute: to convert life energy into its purest form, to distill the essence of existence itself and redirect it, to reverse death. But life energy has to come from somewhere. The machine worked by draining the life force of Pokemon, not willingly, not through some natural transfer. It ripped the energy from living beings, channeling it through standing stones that lined what would become Route 10. These stones, scattered across the landscape, became conduits, absorbers of life. When activated, they would drain everything attached to them, pulling the very essence of existence from Pokemon bound to them and funneling that energy into the machine. Hundreds of Pokemon died to power this resurrection. Hundreds of lives extinguished like candles, their bodies left as empty shells that would eventually petrify and merge with the stones themselves. You can still see them today. The graves lining Route 10 outside Geosinge town. Stone monuments that aren't just markers of death, but are the Pokemon themselves, fossilized, preserved in their final moments of agony as the life was torn from them. But it worked. The machine activated. Energy surged through the crystalline structure, light erupting in colors that shouldn't exist. Power that touched on forces humanity was never meant to command. And in that moment, Floette returned. Not as a spirit, not as an echo, but fully, completely alive again, restored. The eternal flower back in her tiny hands, her eyes opening to see AZ standing before her, tears streaming down his face. She was back. His beloved Pokemon had returned, but she wasn't the only thing that changed that day. The machine had done more than resurrect her. The sheer magnitude of energy involved, the fundamental disruption to the natural order, it had consequences. Both AZ and Floette were exposed to the weapon's power at its peak, bathed in distilled life energy, transformed by forces that bent the rules of mortality itself. And those rules, they broke. Neither of them could die anymore. AZ began to change. His body stretched, growing taller and taller, eventually reaching over 9 feet in height, far beyond any natural human proportion. His lifespan extended indefinitely, but he still aged, slowly, inexorably. His hair turned white, his body weakened, his face lined with centuries of wear. He became a living contradiction, immortal, but not unchanging, eternal, but decaying, trapped in a body that would never die, but would also never stop deteriorating. And Floette stopped entirely. She didn't age, didn't grow, didn't evolve. A normal Floette, exposed to a shiny stone, becomes Florges, a beautiful, fully realized fairy Pokemon with even greater power to nurture and protect flowers. But Eternal Flower Floette, she was locked, frozen at the exact moment of her resurrection, unable to evolve, unable to change. Her stats increased far beyond what a normal Floette should possess, sitting at a base stat total of 551, almost equal to what Florges has. She'd been enhanced, transformed into something beyond her species' natural limits. But she'd also been stopped, locked into a form that was never meant to be permanent. Evolution in the Pokemon world isn't just about getting stronger, it's about growth, maturity, the natural progression of life. When a Pokemon evolves, they're acknowledging change, embracing transformation, becoming something new, while still carrying the essence of what they were. It's a fundamental part of what makes Pokemon. Floette couldn't do that anymore. She was immortal, but she was also stuck. Forever a middle evolution, forever in transition. Neither the innocent Flabeb she'd once been, nor the fully realized Florges she should have become. Just Floette. For eternity. Can you imagine what that feels like? To be aware that you should be changing, growing, evolving. But you can't. Your body won't allow it. The energy that brought you back has locked you in place, denying you the most fundamental aspect of what you are. You're alive, yes, but you're not living. You're existing, perpetually incomplete. And then she learned the truth. However long that took, hours, days, weeks. At some point, Floette discovered what had been done to bring her back. She learned about the hundreds of Pokemon who'd been drained of life, their energy ripped away to fuel her resurrection. She saw the stones on Route 10. She understood that her existence had been purchased with mass death. Her partner, the one who loved her, who grieved for her, who couldn't bear to live without her, had committed genocide to bring her back. And the worst part, AZ wasn't done. The grief that had driven him to build the machine, it hadn't disappeared just because Floette was alive again. If anything, it had transformed into something darker. Rage, hatred, an overwhelming, consuming fury at the world that had taken her from him in the first place. The war was still raging. The same people who'd sent Floette to die were still out there, fighting, killing, sacrificing more Pokemon without a second thought. AZ looked at his machine and realized it could do more than bring life. It could take it on an unimaginable scale. He converted his resurrection device into a weapon, the ultimate weapon, and he fired it. The blast erupted from Geosinge Town, a column of energy that shot into the sky and rained back down across the battlefield. Everything in its path, gone. Humans, Pokemon, plants, the land itself. All of it obliterated in an instant, reduced to ash and memory. The war ended because there was nobody left to fight it. Both sides were destroyed. Thousands upon thousands of lives erased in a single moment of catastrophic power. The energy released was so immense, so fundamentally wrong, that it had lasting effects on reality itself. evolution stones exposed to the blast became megastones, irradiated with a new type of energy that would eventually enable mega evolution. The very fabric of the Kalos region was changed, warped by the weapon's power in ways that would echo through millennia. And Floette, she watched this happen. She saw what AZ had become, what he'd done, not just to bring her back, but to avenge her, to punish the world for daring to let her die. She was the reason for all of it. Her death had triggered the machine's creation. Her resurrection had cost hundreds of lives. In her existence now, it had been used as justification for the annihilation of thousands more. How do you process that? How do you reconcile being alive when your life costs so much death? When the person you love most has become a monster in your name? Floette made a choice. She left, without a word, without an explanation, without giving AZ any chance to apologize or explain or justify. She simply flew away, abandoned the partner who'd moved heaven and earth to bring her back, left him alone with his immortality, his guilt, his slowly decaying body, and his memories of what he'd done. And AZ was left with nothing. The machine was buried by his brother, who'd realized the horror of what had been unleashed. The key to activate it was the only piece that remained, and AZ kept it around his neck. A reminder, a weight, a physical manifestation of his sins. He left Kalos, began wandering the world, searching for Floette, hoping that someday, somehow, she might forgive him. He walked for 3,000 years. Think about that time frame, 3,000 years. Kingdoms rose and fell, civilizations emerged and vanished, languages changed, technology evolved from primitive tools to the modern world. Wars were fought and forgotten, legends became myths, heroes became stories, the entire shape of the world transformed. And AZ just kept walking, getting older, getting weaker, growing more and more hollow with each passing century, watching everyone and everything he'd ever known die and be forgotten, while he remained, unable to die, unable to stop, unable to find peace. But this isn't AZ's story, not really, because while AZ was walking the earth, growing more and more like a shell of who he'd been, Floette was out there too, also walking, also unable to die, also carrying the weight of what had happened, and nobody talks about what that was like for her. The games show us AZ's reunion with Floette at the end of Pokemon X and Y. We see the moment she returns to him, floating down from the sky after he finally battles the player, and in that battle, finds some measure of peace and redemption. It's framed as a happy ending, a tearful reunion, 3,000 years of separation finally ending. The immortal king and his beloved Pokemon together again at last. But what about the 3,000 years before that moment? Where was Floette? What was she doing? What did those millennia feel like for a Pokemon who should have died, who'd been brought back against the natural order? Who carried the power of the ultimate weapon itself in her tiny body? Because here's the thing nobody talks about. Floette didn't just become immortal. She became a living embodiment of the weapon that had killed thousands. The eternal flower she carries? It's not just a flower anymore. It's infused with the same energy that powered the ultimate weapon. The same force that obliterated armies and ended a war through sheer destructive might. She holds it like she always did. Gently, carefully, like any Floette would hold their flower. But what she's actually carrying is a weapon of mass destruction. A concentrated dose of purified death energy. She has access to a move that no other Pokemon can learn. Light of Ruin. The strongest fairy-type special attack in existence, with a base power of 140, For context, that's stronger than Hyper Beam, stronger than anything most legendary Pokemon can unleash, and it comes with recoil damage. Half of whatever damage it deals to the opponent, Floette takes herself. Every time she uses it, she's literally destroying herself, but she can't die, so she just feels it. The pain, the damage, the cost. Light of Ruin. Even the name is haunting. It's not Light of Hope or Light of Life. It's ruin, destruction. The exact opposite of what Floette are supposed to represent. She's a Pokemon who nurtures flowers, who carries an attack that draws power from the Eternal Flower to fire a devastating beam of light. She's become the very thing she should oppose, a weapon, a destroyer, a walking reminder of the ultimate weapon's legacy. Her stats reflect this too. A normal float has a base stat total of 371, weak, fragile, designed to support and nurture rather than fight. But Eternal Flower Floette, 551. Her special attack is 125. Her special defense is 128. She's nearly as powerful as her fully evolved form, Florges, which has a stat total of 552. Just 1 point higher. She's been enhanced, transformed into something far beyond what her species should be capable of. But she can't evolve to match that power. She's locked at this intermediate stage, forever carrying strength she was never meant to possess. She's a paradox, a gentle flower Pokemon with the offensive capability of a legendary, a creature of nurturing and growth with the power to rain destruction, a small, delicate being who's been forced to become something she never wanted to be, and she's been that way for 3,000 years. Let's talk about what that means. Let's talk about immortality from the perspective of a Pokemon. Not a legendary like Arceus or Dialga, who were born into timelessness, who exist as fundamental forces of the universe and understand their role in the eternal cycle. Not even a long-lived species like Ninetales or Dragonite, who might live for centuries but still experience aging and eventually die. No, we're talking about a Floette, a Pokemon whose natural lifespan is, we don't know exactly, but probably comparable to other small fairy types. Decades maybe. Enough to tend gardens, raise young, experience the full cycle of life that every Pokemon is meant to follow. Birth, growth, evolution, maturity, eventual old age, and, finally, death. Return to the earth, becoming part of the cycle that sustains the next generation. Floette was ripped out of the cycle. She was pulled back from death and locked into a state that should be temporary. And then she was set loose in a world that kept moving forward while she didn't. The first year must have been the worst, or maybe the first decade. Time gets strange when you have too much of it. At first, she probably still felt like herself, still remembered what it was like to be a normal Floette, to tend flowers, to exist with the knowledge that someday, eventually, she would age and die and return to the earth like every other living thing. The memory of mortality must have been fresh. The shock of being back, of being alive when she should be dead, of carrying energy that burned inside her like a sun that wouldn't go out. It must have been overwhelming. Did she try to die? Did she test the limits of her immortality, throw herself from heights or into water, or into the path of dangerous Pokemon, desperate to prove that this was temporary, that she could still escape, that death was still an option? How many times did she survive things that should have killed her before she understood? This was permanent. She was stuck forever. And what about evolution? When did she realize she couldn't evolve? A Floette normally evolves through a shiny stone. Did she find one? touch it, feel nothing happen. That moment of realization that she was locked, incomplete, forever denied the transformation that every member of her species is meant to achieve. That must have been crushing, like being told you'll never grow up, never mature, never become what you were meant to be. You're just this forever. The loneliness would have been unbearable. Floette are social Pokemon. They exist in communities, in gardens, in places where flowers bloom, and other Pokemon gather. But how do you connect with anyone when you can't age, can't die, can't change? You meet other Floette and they're temporary. They'll age, evolve into Florges, eventually pass on, and you'll still be here, unchanged, watching them go through the full cycle of life while you're stuck in the middle of yours. Do you make friends? Do you try? Or do you avoid connections entirely, knowing that everyone you get close to will eventually leave you through the simple act of living a normal life? And the guilt. Oh, the guilt must have been staggering. Every moment of existence is a reminder that hundreds of Pokemon died to make this possible. Every time she looks at the eternal flower in her hands, she's seeing the crystallized form of the weapon that killed thousands. Every time she feels the power coursing through her, that enhanced strength that makes her far more powerful than she should be, she's reminded that she's built on death. Her immortality was purchased with massacre. How do you live with that? How do you justify your continued existence when you know the cost? When you look at other Pokemon and think, your species probably died to bring me back. Your ancestor might have been one of the hundreds chained to those stones and drained dry so I could have another chance at life. The Pokemon world has a natural cycle. Xerneas gives life, releasing energy to nurture and sustain. Yveltal takes life, absorbing energy when it reaches the end of its 1,000-year cycle. Both sleep for a millennium before awakening to do it again. It's balance. Creation and destruction, life and death, eternally cycling to maintain equilibrium. Zygarde watches over this balance, ensuring neither Xerneas nor Yveltal go too far, keeping the ecosystem stable. Floette exists outside that cycle now. She's been removed from the natural order. She can't die to feed Yveltal. She can't be reborn through Xerneas' gift of life. She's just here, perpetually. A glitch in the system. An error that shouldn't exist but does. And she knows it. She has to know it. She's a Pokemon. She's connected to the natural world in ways humans can barely comprehend. She must feel how wrong her existence is, how fundamentally she's been separated from everything she was meant to be part of. She's a flower that can't wilt, a living thing that can't die, an anomaly. Did she try to find meaning? Did she attempt to justify her immortality by doing good, by helping others, by using her extended existence to make a positive impact on the world? Maybe, for a while. But how long does that last? How long can you maintain purpose when you have infinite time? When nothing you do really matters because you'll outlive all of it? Help a garden flourish, and in 100 years it'll be gone. Save a Pokemon's life, and in a few decades they'll die anyway. Witness the building of a great city, and in a millennium it might be ruins. Everything is temporary except you. Every accomplishment, every connection, every moment of joy or meaning. Temporary, fleeting, gone almost as soon as you notice it, at least from the perspective of someone who measures time in centuries rather than days. The existential weight of that must be crushing to exist long enough to see that nothing lasts, that every beautiful thing ends, that every bond you form will be broken not by choice but by time. that you are the only permanent thing in a world of impermanence, and the world itself changes. In 3,000 years, the entire Kalos region was transformed. Languages evolved. Human civilization went through countless iterations. Technology advanced from the Bronze Age to the modern era. New Pokemon species might have emerged. Old ones might have gone extinct. The very shape of the land probably changed. Rivers shifting, forests growing and dying, mountains eroding. Floette would have witnessed all of it, watching the world transform around her while she stayed exactly the same. Every time she returned to a place she'd been before, it would be different. Unrecognizable. The flowers she'd tended were gone. The Pokemon she'd known were gone. Even the stones and trees and rivers were different, changed by time's relentless march. She's a ghost, not literally. She's alive, corporeal, more real than any ghost-type Pokemon, but functionally she's a specter, a remnant of an era that no longer exists, walking through a world that's moved on without her. She doesn't belong to any time period. She's from 3,000 years ago but exists in the present. She remembers things nobody else remembers, speaks a version of language that's probably archaic now, understands a Kalos that no longer exists, the isolation of that, the sheer overwhelming loneliness of being the only one who remembers, the only one who lived through all of it, the only one who carries those memories. It would drive most beings insane, but Floette endured, somehow. Maybe it was stubbornness, maybe it was guilt, a feeling that she didn't deserve the escape of madness when so many had died for her. Maybe it was hope, that someday, somehow, things would change, that she'd find a way to die, or a way to live, or a way to forgive AZ and return to him, or a way to forgive herself for surviving when so many didn't. Whatever kept her going, it must have been powerful, because she didn't fade, didn't give up, didn't become a monster or a force of destruction despite carrying the power of one inside her tiny body. She just kept existing, kept wandering, kept being Floette, even when being Floette had lost all meaning. And here's the most haunting part. Light of Ruin wasn't just a move she could use, it was part of her now. The energy of the ultimate weapon, permanently infused into the eternal flower she carries, giving her access to this devastating attack. At level 50, she learns it, as if the universe itself was saying, "You've existed long enough, you've carried this burden far enough, here's your reward." The ability to destroy. Did she use it? In those 3,000 years, did she ever unleash Light of Ruin on something? In a moment of rage, of despair, of just wanting to feel something other than emptiness? Did she fire that beam of pure destructive light? Watch it obliterate whatever was in its path? Feel half the damage tear through her own body? And then realize, as she regenerated from wounds that should have killed her, that even this couldn't end her existence? That would be the ultimate cruelty, wouldn't it? To be given the power to destroy anything, except yourself. Light of Ruin. The name takes on new meaning when you think about it from Floette's perspective. It's not just a weapon, it's a mirror, a reflection of what she's become. She was ruined by light, by the light of the ultimate weapon that brought her back and made her immortal. And now she carries the light inside her, this ruinous force that can destroy anything it touches. She is Light of Ruin, a living embodiment of the concept, beautiful and terrible in equal measure, a tragedy with wings, holding a flower that blooms with death. The Pokemon world has many examples of tragedy, of creatures caught in circumstances beyond their control, of lives twisted by forces they didn't ask for. But most of them get to die eventually. Most of them, no matter how much they suffer, have the comfort of knowing it will end someday. They have the luxury of mortality. Floette doesn't even have that. She's a monument, a living memorial to the Kalos War, to the ultimate weapon, to every Pokemon that died in that conflict and in its aftermath. She carries their deaths with her, literally in the form of the energy that keeps her alive. She's a grave that walks, a tombstone that breathes, a reminder that some prices are too high, some resurrections too costly, some loves too destructive. And nobody in the modern world knows this. To most people who've encountered the story of AZ and his Floette, it's a tale of tragic romance. A king who loved his Pokemon so much he couldn't let her go. A forbidden resurrection, a painful separation, a hopeful reunion. It's framed as a love story, but from Floette's perspective, it's a horror story. It's the nightmare of being brought back wrong, of existing as a mistake, of carrying more guilt and pain than any creature should be able to bear. It's about being trapped in a body that won't die, a form that won't change, a life that never ends no matter how much you want it to. She didn't ask for this, none of it. She died in a war she didn't start, and someone who loved her brought her back without asking if she wanted to come back. She was given immortality without consent, enhanced with power she never sought, transformed into something she was never meant to be. And then she was expected to be grateful, to be happy, to accept that hundreds died so she could live. How could she? How could anyone? So she left. She flew away from AZ and spent 3,000 years doing what? We don't know. The games don't tell us. There's no record of where she went, what she did, how she survived all that time. We only know that she returned at the end, when AZ finally found peace, when he battled the player and demonstrated that he'd learned something, changed somehow, moved beyond the grief and rage that had consumed him. But what happened in between? What did those 3 millennia look like for a small flower Pokemon wandering the world alone? That's what we need to talk about. That's the story nobody tells. The dark side of eternal life, viewed through the eyes of a creature who never asked for it and has no way to escape it. The loneliness, the guilt, the endless grinding weight of existing in a world that moves forward while you're frozen in place. What does 3,000 years of solitude do to a Pokemon? To a being whose nature is to nurture, to care, to exist in harmony with the cycle of life. When that cycle has been denied to them, let's explore that. Let's talk about what Floette's immortality really means. Not as a gift, not as a miracle, not as a romantic gesture of undying love, but as what it really is. A curse. The dark side of eternal life. AZ's Floette story, Part 2. The first century was probably the hardest, not because the pain was fresh, though it was, not because the guilt was overwhelming, though it certainly was that too, but because in the first century, Floette still remembered what it felt like to be mortal. She still carried the muscle memory of a normal life, the instincts of a creature who was supposed to age and change and eventually return to the earth. Her sense of time was still calibrated for a normal Pokemon's lifespan. A year felt like a year. A decade felt like a decade. Loss still hurt in the immediate way it's supposed to hurt, rather than the distant, numbed way it hurts when you've experienced it 1,000 times. She could still form attachments without the crushing knowledge that everyone she cared about would be gone in what felt like a blink. But time has a way of changing you, even when your body refuses to change. Especially then, imagine the first time Floette returned to a place after a century had passed. Maybe it was a forest where she'd tended flowers, spent a few years nurturing a garden, making it beautiful. She comes back expecting to see her work, and it's gone. Completely. The flowers have died and been replaced by different species. The trees are larger or fallen or cleared away entirely. The Pokemon she knew are dead, replaced by their great-great-grandchildren who have no memory of her. Even the shape of the forest has changed. Boundaries shifted, paths overgrown, everything different. And she's exactly the same. That's when it would start to sink in. The true nature of what's been done to her. She's not just immortal in the sense that she can't die. She's been removed from time itself. The world flows forward, and she's a stone in the current. Unmoved, unchanged, while everything rushes past her. How long before a century starts to feel like a year? How long before a decade feels like a week? When you have 3,000 years, your perception of time warps, stretches. What once felt significant becomes trivial. What once felt like loss becomes just another Tuesday. The first 100 Pokemon you watch die break your heart. The next 100 hurt less. By the 1,000th, you barely notice. Not because you've become cruel, but because you've become numb. You have to. The alternative is to feel every loss with equal weight, and no mind can sustain that kind of accumulated grief. So Floette would have learned to let go. Not in a healthy way, not in the way a normal Pokemon releases attachments at the end of their life, but in the way a drowning person releases breath. Because holding on hurts too much. Because attachment is a luxury afforded to beings who don't have to watch everything they love erode and vanish while they remain. She would have moved through different phases, different attempts to cope with the impossible situation she found herself in. Maybe at first she tried to hide, found a remote place, far from civilization, far from other Pokemon, where she could exist without being reminded of what she'd lost. A cave perhaps, or a mountain peak, or a forgotten island. Somewhere she wouldn't have to watch others living normal lives, wouldn't have to see Flabébé evolving into Floette, then Floette evolving into Florge, completing the journey she'd been denied, wouldn't have to feel the ache of seeing the world move forward while she stayed behind. But isolation has its own kind of torture. Floette are social creatures. They need connection, community, purpose. Lock one away in solitude and they wither. Not physically, but spiritually. And Floette couldn't even wither properly. She just had to sit with the loneliness, day after day, year after year, feeling it compound without any release. So maybe she came back, tried to integrate, attempted to live among other Pokemon, to pretend she was normal, to hide her immortality and the energy burning inside her. She'd find a garden, a forest, a meadow, and she'd do what Floette do, tend flowers, nurture growth, help wilting blooms recover, celebrate when gardens flourished. And for a while, it might have felt almost normal, almost like she was herself again, just a Floette doing Floette things, living a Floette life. But then her companions would start to age. The other Floette she'd befriended would evolve, become Florge, take on the responsibilities and appearance of fully matured fairy Pokemon. And she'd still be this. They'd look at her with questions in their eyes. Why haven't you evolved? Are you waiting for the right stone? Is something wrong? And what could she say? How do you explain that you're broken in a way they can't comprehend? That you're stuck in a form that's supposed to be temporary, locked into incompletion by forces that bent the rules of existence itself? So she'd leave, before the questions became too insistent, before anyone looked too closely, before they noticed that she didn't age, didn't change, didn't sleep sometimes because the energy inside her burned too hot for rest. She'd move on to the next place, start the cycle again, knowing it would end the same way. How many times did she do this? How many communities did she join and then abandon? How many friendships did she start, only to walk away from before anyone discovered what she really was? And the guilt would follow her, always, because every time she tended a flower, every time she helped something grow, she'd remember. She'd think about the hundreds of Pokemon who'd been drained dry so she could have this chance to nurture life. The irony was so bitter it burned. She existed to help things grow. But her existence was built on death. She celebrated life, but was herself a monument to destruction. Did she ever try to use light of ruin on herself? Stand in some abandoned place, far from anyone who might be hurt, and fire that devastating beam straight up? Let it rain back down on her, feel the recoil tear through her body with the full force of that 140 base power attack? The pain would be unimaginable, catastrophic, the kind of damage that should absolutely kill a fragile Pokemon like Floette. But she wouldn't die, she'd regenerate. The same energy that made her immortal would knit her back together, force her to heal, refuse to let her escape. And she'd be left lying there in a crater of her own making, surrounded by destruction, still alive, still conscious, still trapped. That might have been the worst moment. The moment she realized that even the weapon she carried inside her, the one thing powerful enough to destroy almost anything, couldn't destroy her. She was immune even to her own ruinous light, trapped not just by circumstance, but by the fundamental nature of what she'd become. The seasons would have lost meaning. Spring, summer, fall, winter. They'd blur together. She'd seen 3,000 springs, 3,000 winters, the same patterns repeating endlessly, year after year, century after century. At first, each season would have been precious, a marker of time passing, a reminder that the world was still moving even if she wasn't. But eventually, they'd just become noise, background rhythm to an existence that had no real progression. And the world changed around her in ways that must have been disorienting. 3,000 years is enough time for languages to evolve dramatically. The Kalos that Floette knew as a young Pokemon, it spoke differently, used different words, different expressions. If she tried to communicate with humans or Pokemon in the modern era, would they even understand her? Or would her way of speaking sound ancient, archaic, wrong? Imagine trying to connect with someone and realizing that even your words are from a different time, that the very language you think in has evolved past you. You're not just socially isolated, you're linguistically isolated, culturally isolated. Everything about you marks you as from another era, even when you're trying to fit in. And the places would have changed so much. Floette would have memories of Kalos when it was a very different region. Before Lumiose City became the sprawling metropolis it is in the modern era. Before the Prism Tower was built. Before most of the current infrastructure existed. She'd remember forests that were now cities, rivers that had changed course, mountains that had eroded, settlements that had been abandoned and reclaimed by nature. Every time she returned to somewhere she'd been before, it would be like looking at a familiar face that had been completely reconstructed. The bones might be the same, the geography, the basic shape of the land, but everything else would be different, unrecognizable, like looking at a painting someone had painted over again and again until the original was completely invisible beneath layers of new imagery. Nowhere would feel like home. 'cause home doesn't exist when you outlive everything. And then there's the question of other immortals. Did she ever encounter AZ during those 3,000 years? They were both wandering the same world, both cursed with the same endless existence. In all that time, across all those miles, did their paths ever cross? Maybe. Maybe they'd see each other from a distance. AZ, towering and unmistakable, moving through a town or along a road. And Floette would hide, or flee, or simply watch from afar, seeing what time had done to him. Seeing him grow older, more worn, more hollow. Seeing the physical manifestation of guilt and grief in his posture, his movements, the way he carried himself like a man bearing an invisible weight. Did she feel pity, anger, both, neither? When you've been alive for centuries, emotions become complicated. You can simultaneously hate someone for what they did and feel sorry for what they've become. You can hold anger and compassion in the same breath, understanding that the person who hurt you is also suffering, even if their suffering doesn't erase yours. But she never approached, never spoke to him, just observed sometimes from whatever safe distance she'd established, and then moved on, because forgiveness wasn't something she could give. Not yet, maybe not ever. The wound was too deep, cut across too many layers of her existence. You don't forgive someone for making you immortal. You can't. The offense is ongoing, every moment you continue to exist. But worse than encountering AZ would be encountering other Pokemon who'd been part of the war. Not immortals. There were only 2 of those, but descendants. Relatives of the Pokemon who'd died. And here's the thing. Floette would know. She'd be able to tell. When you've lived that long, when you carry that much guilt, you develop an instinct for it. You see a Steelix and think, your ancestor might have been chained to one of those stones. You see a Salamence and wonder, did your great-great-grandparent die screaming as the life was ripped from them to fuel my resurrection? Every Pokemon she met was potentially connected to her trauma. Every interaction carried the ghost of what had been done, and they wouldn't know. They'd just see a Floette, unusual perhaps for carrying such a strange flower, but still just a fairy-type Pokemon. They'd have no idea they were talking to a living graveyard, a repository of their ancestors' deaths. How do you form genuine connections when you're carrying that kind of secret? When every friendship is built on a foundation of hidden mass murder, when being honest about what you are would mean revealing something so horrific that nobody could possibly understand or accept it, you don't. You can't. So you stay alone, or you stay dishonest, and both options are their own kind of torture. The natural cycle would have been the hardest thing to witness, because Floette, as a fairy-type Pokemon deeply connected to nature and growth, would have an instinctive understanding of how life is supposed to work. She'd see it play out around her constantly. Birth, growth, maturity, reproduction, aging, death. The endless wheel that every living thing is meant to turn on. And she'd be outside it, watching, unable to participate. She couldn't age, couldn't mature, couldn't reproduce. The data from the games confirms that Eternal Flower Floette is in the undiscovered egg group. She's functionally sterile. Another aspect of normal Pokemon life denied to her. She'd see other Floette find partners, create eggs, nurture the next generation. And she'd know that path was closed to her forever. She's not part of the cycle. She's a splinter, a fragment that broke off and now exists separately, eternally, with no way to rejoin the flow. And this is where Xerneas and Yveltal become important to understanding Floette's torment. These two legendary Pokemon represent the fundamental forces of life and death in Kalos. Xerneas gives life, releasing energy when it reaches the end of its 1,000-year cycle, sharing vitality with everything around it before transforming into a tree and sleeping. Yveltal takes life, absorbing energy from everything nearby when it dies, draining them to fuel its own transformation into a cocoon before slumbering for a millennium. Together, they maintain balance, creation and destruction, beginning and ending, the natural rhythm that keeps the ecosystem stable. Zeegard watches over both, ensuring neither goes too far, stepping in if the balance is threatened. This is the cosmic order. This is how life and death are supposed to work in the Pokemon world, not as opposing forces, but as complementary ones. You can't have eternal life without eternal death. You can't have endless creation without eventual destruction. They need each other. They define each other. And Floette exists in violation of this order. She's been touched by a force that mimics Xerneas' power. The ultimate weapon was designed to channel life energy, to create and resurrect. But it does so wrongly, artificially, without the balance. It takes from Yveltal's domain. Death, endings, the absorption of life force. But it doesn't give properly to Xerneas' domain. Instead, it creates something that shouldn't exist. Immortality without transformation. Life without death. Existence without participation in the cycle. Floette would understand this. On a deep, instinctive level, she'd know that she's wrong, that her existence is an affront to the natural order. She can feel it in her bones, in the energy that won't stop burning inside her, in the way her body refuses to age or change or do any of the things it's supposed to do. Did she ever seek out Xerneas? Try to find the life Pokemon, hoping that the same force that gives life might be able to take back the twisted version of it that she'd been given. She'd search for years, maybe decades, tracking legends and rumors about where Xerneas might be hibernating. And eventually she'd find it, the tree form, dormant and peaceful in some hidden forest, and she'd approach, place her tiny hands on the bark, pour out her story in whatever way Pokemon communicate these things. Through sounds, through emotions, through the energy that all Pokemon can sense in each other. She'd beg, please, take this back. Undo what was done. Let me die. Let me return to the cycle. Let me be normal again. But Xerneas can't help her, even if it woke, even if it heard her plea, even if it wanted to help. It can't, because what's been done to Floette goes beyond Xerneas' power. The ultimate weapon didn't just grant life, it fundamentally altered her existence on a level that even legendary Pokemon can't easily fix. She's been changed at a cosmic level, written into reality in a way that doesn't have an easy undo button. Xerneas might communicate this gently, with sadness, with regret that one of nature's children has been so grievously wounded. But the answer would still be no. You're beyond my reach now. I'm sorry. I can't help you. And Floette would leave, more alone than ever. Because even the god of life can't save her from the life she's been cursed with. What about Yveltal? If Xerneas can't give her death, maybe Yveltal can take her life? Maybe the destruction Pokemon, with its power to drain the life force from everything around it, could finally end her existence? But that's even more complicated, because Yveltal's power works on normal life force, natural life energy, the kind that flows through every living creature, sustaining them, marking them as part of the living world. Floette's life force isn't normal, it's artificial, reinforced, fundamentally different from what Yveltal is designed to absorb. She's been saturated with distilled life energy from the ultimate weapon, enhanced beyond natural limits. Her existence is too strong, too concentrated, too wrong for Eviltal's natural absorption to work on her the way it would work on a normal Pokemon. She might even be dangerous to Eviltal. What happens if the destruction Pokemon tries to drain something that contains the concentrated life force of hundreds of Pokemon? Something that carries the energy of the ultimate weapon itself? It could disrupt Eviltal's own cycle, throw off the balance even further, create more problems than it solves, so Eviltal can't help her either. Even the god of death is powerless before the twisted immortality she carries. She's stuck, truly completely stuck. Even the legendary Pokemon who govern life and death in Kalos can't free her from what she's become. She exists in a space between their domains, belonging to neither, claimed by both, impossible to categorize or correct. That realization, that would be devastating. To know that even cosmic forces can't help you, that you're so broken, so fundamentally wrong, that the very beings who control the concepts you need, they can't touch you. You're beyond help, beyond salvation, beyond even the reach of gods. What do you do when you realize that? When you understand that there's no fix coming, no miracle that will restore you to normalcy, no power in existence that can undo what's been done. You can't die, you can't change, you can't even hope for eventual release because the beings who should be able to grant that release can't. You endure because you have no other choice. And so the centuries roll on. Floette keeps existing because she has to, not because she wants to. She moves through the world like a ghost, connecting with nothing, belonging nowhere, carrying her burden of guilt and grief and endless, grinding loneliness. She witnesses the evolution of civilization, sees humans develop new technologies, new societies, new ways of interacting with Pokemon. She watches as the partnership between humans and Pokemon deepens, becoming less exploitative and more mutual. The kind of bond that should have always existed. The kind of bond that, if it had existed 3,000 years ago, might have prevented the war that killed her in the first place. Does that make her angry, bitter, to see that the world learned from its mistakes, but she still has to pay the price for those mistakes forever? That humans and Pokemon now treat each other with respect and love, while she's stuck carrying the consequences of an era when Pokemon were treated as tools? Or does she find some measure of peace in it, knowing that at least her death, her original death in the war, wasn't entirely meaningless? That the horror of that war and the horror of what AZ did to end it at least led to some kind of positive change? That the world learned something, even if the lesson cost thousands of lives? Probably both. Emotions aren't clean when you've lived that long. You can be angry and grateful simultaneously, bitter and hopeful, resentful and forgiving, all of it tangled together, impossible to separate, creating a mess of feelings that you can't even begin to process. She'd see the creation of Pokeballs, watch as humans develop technology to store and transport Pokemon safely, creating a new kind of partnership. Did she ever consider being caught? Letting some trainer capture her, taking the burden of existence off her own shoulders and placing it on someone else? Letting them decide where she goes, what she does, how she spends her immortality? But she couldn't, because any trainer who caught her would eventually die. In a few decades they'd be gone, and she'd outlive them, and probably their grandchildren, and their great-grandchildren. Forming that kind of bond, knowing it would end, knowing she'd have to watch another person age and die while she remained. It would be cruel to both of them. So she stayed alone, wild, free in the technical sense, but imprisoned by her own immortality. The introduction of mega evolution would have been strange. She'd see Pokemon suddenly tapping into a new kind of energy, temporarily transforming into more powerful forms. And she'd recognize that energy. Of course she would, because Mega Stones were created by the ultimate weapon. When AZ fired it 3,000 years ago, the energy released was so intense that it irradiated certain evolution stones, transforming them into Mega Stones. The same blast that made her immortal also created the foundation for Mega Evolution. So every time she sees a Pokemon Mega evolve, she's seeing a direct consequence of the weapon that ruined her life. The same energy that flows through her, keeping her immortal and incomplete, also flows through those stones. She's connected to Mega Evolution in a way no other Pokemon is. She's a living proof of concept, a demonstration of what happens when you're exposed to that energy at full power, without the temporary safeguards that Mega Evolution provides. Does she feel ownership over it? Pride? Disgust? Probably disgust, because Mega Evolution, for all its power, is at least temporary. Pokemon can Mega Evolve and then return to normal. They get the power without the curse. They get to transform and then change back, participating in the cycle rather than being locked out of it. She doesn't even get that. Her transformation is permanent. She's stuck in this enhanced state, unable to revert, unable to evolve forward, just frozen. And then there's the question of other fairy types. Because Floette is a fairy type Pokemon, and fairy type as a classification is deeply connected to nature, emotion, and the mystical aspects of the Pokemon world. Fairy types are often guardians, nurturers, beings that exist to maintain balance and harmony. They're closely tied to the emotional and spiritual health of the environment. So what does it mean when a fairy type is fundamentally broken? When a creature that should represent harmony and balance is instead a walking violation of natural law? Is she felt by other fairy types? Do they sense the wrongness in her? The way her energy signature doesn't match what a Floette should be? The way she reads as both alive and not alive, natural and unnatural simultaneously? Maybe they avoid her instinctively. Maybe when she tries to approach other fairy types, they flee without understanding why, just responding to some deep instinct that tells them, this is wrong, this is dangerous, this is not what it appears to be. Stay away. And that would hurt, not just practically, cutting off another avenue for connection, but spiritually, being rejected by your own type, by the Pokemon who should understand you best, because you've been changed into something they can no longer recognize as one of them. She's not just alone, she's been exiled from her own kind on a fundamental level. 3,000 years. That's long enough to see empires rise and fall. Long enough to see multiple cycles of history. Long enough to see patterns emerge. Humans making the same mistakes over and over, just in slightly different ways. Wars still happen, Pokemon still die. People still act out of greed, fear, desperation. The specifics change, but the underlying truth remains. The world is still broken, still violent, still full of suffering. And Floette has to watch it all, has to witness every war knowing that she's a product of war. Has to see Pokemon suffering and remember that hundreds suffered specifically to bring her back. Has to observe the ongoing cycle of violence and death and remember that she's been removed from even that cycle. She can't die in these wars, can't sacrifice herself to save others, can't even participate in the suffering in a meaningful way because she's immune to it. She's a witness, eternal, unchanging, recording everything but affecting nothing. Or maybe she did affect things. Maybe there were moments across those 3,000 years where she intervened, saw a Pokemon in danger and helped them, saw a flower dying and brought it back, saw injustice and stood against it, using her strange power and immortality to make things slightly better in small ways that history would never record. Maybe that's how she survived, not by accepting her curse, but by using it, turning the weapon she'd become into a tool for good, saving lives to balance against the lives that were taken for her, helping where she could, when she could, in whatever small ways were available to someone who had to hide what she truly was. It wouldn't erase the guilt, nothing could do that, but maybe it made the guilt bearable. Maybe it gave her something resembling purpose, a reason to keep existing when existence itself felt like punishment. Or maybe not. Maybe she spent all 3,000 years just wandering, just existing, just trying to get through each day without thinking too hard about the endless days stretching ahead of her. Survival mode for 3 millennia. The most drawn-out, excruciating form of survival imaginable. And through it all, she carried that flower, the eternal flower, black and red petals, a constant reminder of what she was, what had been done, what she'd become. She couldn't put it down. It was part of her now, infused with the same energy that kept her alive. To lose it would be to lose herself. Though whether that would be good or bad is unclear. Did she ever wish the flower would wilt? Just once, after all this time, show some sign of decay? Prove that even this artifact of her immortality could eventually fail? But it never did, never would. It was as eternal as she was, preserved by the same unnatural forces. The flower was her companion, the only thing that had been with her through all of it. AZ had abandoned her the moment she fled. Other Pokemon came and went. Places changed beyond recognition. Languages evolved. Civilizations transformed. But the flower remained, constant, unchanging, eternal. Was that comforting? Or was it just another reminder of the cage she was trapped in? Probably both. Like everything else in her existence, it was complicated, painful and precious at the same time. A symbol of her curse, and the only continuity she had across 3,000 years of discontinuity. And then, finally, after all that time, something changed. Not with her. She was still the same, still immortal, still incomplete, still carrying the weight of the centuries. But with AZ, something shifted in him. After 3,000 years of wandering, of searching, of carrying his own guilt and grief, he finally began to let go. Floette would have sensed it. However fairy types sense these things. Whatever connection still existed between her and the one who'd made her immortal. She'd know. She'd feel the change in him. The way his heart was beginning to open again after being closed for millennia. The way he was finally starting to move past the trauma that had consumed him for so long. And it would have called to her, not forced her, not demanded anything, just called, a gentle pull, an invitation. Come back, I've changed, I've learned, I've grown in the only ways an immortal can grow. I'm not the person who fired the weapon anymore. I'm not the king who chose vengeance over wisdom. I'm just someone who loved you, who still loves you, who understands now what he did wrong, who knows he can never make it right, but who wants to try anyway. Come back. And Floette, after 3,000 years of exile, of wandering, of carrying her burden alone, she had to decide. Could she forgive him? Could she return to the one who'd made her immortal without her consent? who'd killed hundreds of Pokemon to bring her back, who'd then killed thousands more in a rage-fueled act of vengeance. Could she look at him and see something other than the source of all her suffering? The answer came during a parade in Lumio City, when AZ challenged the new champion to a battle, when he finally smiled, genuinely smiled for the first time in 3,000 years, when his heart opened enough to feel something other than grief and guilt. That's when she knew, that's when she felt it, the shift, the change, the moment when AZ stopped being the person who'd created the ultimate weapon and became just AZ again, the man who'd loved her, who'd received her as a gift from his mother, who'd cared for her before the war twisted everything into horror. And she descended from the sky. It wasn't forgiveness, not completely. You don't forgive someone for 3,000 years of suffering. You can't. The wound is too deep, too old, too much a part of who you've become. Forgiving that would be like forgiving your own existence. And how do you forgive something you had no choice about? But it was something. Acceptance, maybe, or understanding, or just exhaustion. 3,000 years is a long time to carry anger. Eventually, even rage gets tired. Eventually, even the deepest hurt starts to feel like background noise rather than immediate pain. She came back because she was tired of being alone. Because even a complicated, painful connection was better than no connection at all. Because AZ, for all his faults, for all the terrible things he'd done, he was the only other being in existence who truly understood what she'd been through, who knew what it meant to be immortal in a mortal world, who carried the same guilt, the same weight, the same endless, grinding loneliness. They were broken in the same ways, cursed by the same weapon, trapped in the same immortality. And maybe that was enough, maybe that was all they had, but it was something. AZ fell to his knees when he saw her, trembling, tears streaming down his face. 3,000 years of searching, of hoping, of carrying guilt so heavy it had bent his soul. And she'd come back. She'd actually come back. And Floette. She landed gently, approached slowly, looked at this towering figure who'd once been a king, and was now just a broken old man who'd lived too long. And in that moment, whatever passed between them, it wasn't redemption, it wasn't healing, it wasn't making things right, but it was acknowledgement, recognition. Two beings who'd been alone for 3,000 years, finding each other again. Not because the past had been erased, but because the present was unbearable without some kind of connection. They were together again. The immortal king and the eternal flower, both broken, both changed beyond recognition by what had been done, both still carrying the weight of the weapon that had created them, but together. And maybe that was as close to a happy ending as either of them would ever get. The thing is, the reunion doesn't fix anything. Not really. Floette is still immortal, still can't evolve, still can't die, still carries light of ruin inside her, this devastating power that marks her as a weapon. Whether she wants to be one or not, she's still outside the natural cycle, still separated from Xerneas and Eviltal's rhythm, still fundamentally wrong in ways that can never be made right. And AZ is still aging, still decaying, still moving towards some eventual end that Floette will outlive. Even if they're together now, even if they've reconciled, he'll die eventually. Maybe not for another few centuries, but eventually. His immortality was never perfect, and when he's gone, she'll be alone again. Forever this time, because there's nobody else who shares her curse. So what was the point? What did the reunion accomplish? Maybe nothing, maybe everything. Maybe the point isn't to fix what's broken, because some things can't be fixed. Maybe the point is just to acknowledge the brokenness, to say, yes, this happened, yes, it was terrible, yes, we're both destroyed by it. But we don't have to be destroyed alone. Maybe that's all healing ever is when the wound is too deep to close. Just finding someone who understands, someone who can sit with you in the pain without trying to make it go away. Someone who knows that some prices are too high to ever be paid off, but who will help you carry the debt anyway. Floette came back because AZ is the only one who knows, the only one who understands what it's like to be removed from time, to watch the world move forward without you, to carry guilt that compounds across centuries. He's the only one who can look at her and not see a Pokemon, but see a person. Someone with 3,000 years of experiences, memories, losses, griefs, tiny moments of joy that got harder and harder to find as time stretched on. He sees her, actually sees her, not as a resurrected Pokemon, not as a miracle, not as proof of his genius or his love or his power, but as someone who's been suffering just as long as he has, in different but equally terrible ways. And she sees him, not as the monster who killed thousands, not as the genius who broke nature's laws, not as the king who chose vengeance over wisdom, but as someone who made a terrible mistake and has spent 3,000 years trying to understand it, who's been broken by his own actions, who's paid the price for his choices in ways that most people couldn't even comprehend. They're witnesses to each other's pain, and sometimes that's all you can ask for. Someone who knows, someone who won't diminish it or try to fix it or tell you it's not as bad as you think. Someone who just knows. So Floette stays, not because everything's okay now, not because the past has been forgiven or forgotten, but because after 3,000 years of wandering alone, carrying her burden in isolation, she's found the one other person who carries the same burden. And maybe that's not happiness. Maybe it's not even healing, but it's something. It's acknowledgement. It's witness suffering. It's shared trauma. It's two broken beings saying, we're broken. We know we're broken. We know we always will be. But we don't have to be broken alone. And in a world where you can't die, can't change, can't escape what you've become, that might be the closest thing to grace you'll ever find. The Eternal Flower Floette, a living monument to the cost of resurrection, a walking graveyard carrying the deaths of hundreds inside her tiny body, a weapon she never asked to become, a creature locked outside the natural cycle of life and death, an immortal who never wanted immortality, a Pokemon who can't be a Pokemon anymore in any meaningful sense. She's a tragedy, a cautionary tale, a reminder that some gifts are curses, that love can be destructive when it refuses to accept loss, that immortality isn't a blessing when you're not meant for it, that being saved can be worse than dying when the price of salvation is too high. But she's also something else. She's a survivor, someone who endured 3,000 years of impossible suffering and came out the other side still capable of connection, still capable of compassion, still capable of returning to the one who hurt her most because she understood on some level that he'd been hurt just as badly by his own actions. She's proof that even when you're broken in ways that can't be fixed, even when you exist in violation of natural law, even when you carry the weight of mass death and endless isolation, you can still find moments of meaning, still make choices, still decide who you want to be, even when what you are is unchangeable. Floette will never die, will never evolve, will never participate in the cycle that every other Pokemon takes for granted. She'll carry Light of Ruin forever, this terrible power that marks her as wrong, as dangerous, as other. She'll watch AZ die eventually, probably within the next few centuries, and then she'll be alone again. Truly alone, the last immortal, the final remnant of the war that ended 3,000 years ago. But until then, she has this moment, this connection, this acknowledgement of shared pain, this small island of understanding in an ocean of isolation. And maybe that's enough. Not to make it okay, not to justify what was done, not to make immortality worthwhile or bearable or anything other than the curse it truly is, but enough to keep existing, enough to face another day, another year, another century, enough to say, yes, I'm broken, yes, I'm suffering, yes, this is terrible and wrong and should never have happened, but I'm still here, I'm still me, I'm still Floette, even if I'm Floette in a way that no one else can ever be. And I'll keep being Floette, carrying this burden, existing in this impossible state, because I don't have a choice. And sometimes, when you don't have a choice about existing, the only choice left is how you exist, with bitterness or with acceptance, with rage or with peace, alone or with someone who understands. Floette chose understanding, chose connection, chose to return, not because it fixed anything, but because after 3,000 years of wandering alone, she was just so tired of being the only one who knew what those 3,000 years had cost. So there she is, the Eternal Flower Floette, the darkest fairy tale Kalos has to offer, the tragedy wrapped in flower petals, the weapon that looks like a Pokemon, the immortal who never wanted to be, the survivor of a war nobody remembers, carrying deaths nobody mourns, existing in a state nobody understands. She's the living embodiment of the question, is it better to have loved and lost, or to have lost and then been forced to exist forever with that loss? And the answer, after 3,000 years, she still doesn't know. Maybe there is no answer. Maybe some questions are too big, too painful, too existential to have satisfying resolutions. Maybe all you can do is keep existing, keep carrying the weight, keep putting one foot in front of the other even when there's nowhere to go and nothing to achieve. Maybe that's what immortality really is. Not living forever, but existing forever with questions that have no answers. And Floette, she'll keep existing, keep carrying her eternal flower, keep holding Light of Ruin inside her like a sun that won't go out. Keep being this impossible, tragic, broken thing that should never have been created but was, because she doesn't have a choice. And sometimes, when all your choices have been taken away, the only thing left is to witness, to remember, to exist as proof that some prices are too high, some resurrections too costly, some loves too destructive. Floette is that proof, walking, breathing, eternal proof, and she'll keep being that proof until the sun burns out, the stars die, and time itself finally ends. Because that's what immortality means, forever, whether you want it or not. The dark side of eternal life, AZ's Floette story. Part 3 condensed. Let's talk about the moments nobody sees. The small, quiet tragedies that accumulate across 3,000 years. Because here's what people don't understand about immortality. It's not the big moments that break you. It's the small things, the tiny, everyday reminders that you don't belong. Imagine Floette in a garden somewhere, 200 years into her immortality. She's found a community of grass and fairy-type Pokemon who welcome her. They don't ask too many questions. They just let her help, let her nurture the flowers, and for a few seasons, it's almost normal. She can almost pretend she's just another Floette. But then she makes a mistake, a small one. She mentions something about a flower species that used to grow in this region 2 centuries ago. She talks about it casually, like it was recent, because to her it kind of is. And the other Pokemon look at her strangely. How do you know that? That hasn't grown here in anyone's memory. That's ancient history. And Floette realizes her mistake. She's exposed herself. Not dramatically, but enough to mark herself as other, as wrong, so she leaves, quietly, before anyone can ask more questions, before anyone can look at her too closely, and she takes that with her. The memory of belonging, briefly, and the knowledge that she can never really belong anywhere, because eventually she'll always slip up. That happened over and over, hundreds of times across 3,000 years. Small communities, brief moments of connection, then exposure and flight. Or consider this moment. Floette, maybe 500 years in, encounters a young Flabébé, newly hatched, tiny, innocent, and Floette helps her, teaches her, shows her how to tend flowers, how to draw out their power. It's instinctive. But as she's teaching, she's also calculating. This Flabébé will grow up, will evolve into Floette in a few years, then into Florges maybe a decade after that, will find a partner, have eggs, raise her own young, live a full life, eventually die, surrounded by family, having completed the cycle. And Floette will still be here, watching, unable to do any of those things. The Flabébé looks at her with such trust, such innocent faith. But Floette knows she can't stay, because if she stays, she'll have to watch this baby grow old, have to watch her achieve all the things Floette herself can never achieve. So she leaves, again, flies away before the attachment can deepen, and the Flabébé probably never understands why, just knows that the kind Floette who helped her disappeared like a dream. That's what immortality looks like up close. Not grand tragedies, but small abandonments. Not epic suffering, but quiet, constant pain that never quite reaches the level of unbearable, but never stops either. Let's talk about the first time Floette saw another Floette die of old age, maybe a century into her immortality. One of the older Florges in a group she'd been staying with, slowing down, moving less gracefully, her colors fading, all the signs of a Pokemon nearing the end. And then one morning, she's gone, passed away peacefully, returned to the earth, her body already beginning decomposition, feeding the flowers she'd spent her life tending. The natural cycle completing itself. The other Pokemon mourn, gather around her body, acknowledge the pain of loss, but also the rightness of it. She lived well, she grew old, she got to complete her journey. This is how it's supposed to be, and Floette looks at that body and feels something. Not quite jealousy, not quite grief, something more complicated, because the Florges got to do what Floette never can, got to finish, got to return to the earth and become part of something larger. Floette can't return to the earth, her body won't decompose. When she dies, if she ever dies, what happens? Does her body just remain forever? A preserved corpse that won't rot, won't decay, won't serve any purpose? She doesn't even get to contribute to the cycle in death. She's locked out entirely. That realization, standing over the body of a Pokemon who got to die naturally, might have been one of the worst moments. The traveling would have its own rhythm, Floette moving through Kalos and beyond, following some instinct, avoiding places where she'd been too recently, seeking places that felt safe, neutral, but Kalos is only so big. Eventually, after a few centuries, she'd start returning to places she'd been before, and finding them changed beyond recognition. A forest she'd lived in 300 years ago. Now a city. The trees gone, replaced by buildings. The flowers she'd tended, extinct now. A mountain she'd climbed, now lower, eroded. The cave she'd sheltered in, collapsed. Nothing stays. Nothing lasts. Everything she touches, temporary, gone before she can even properly remember what it looked like. And the worst part? She stops remembering clearly. Not because her memory fails, but because 3,000 years is too much. The memories start to blur together. The first century becomes a vague sense of early time rather than distinct years. She remembers gardens, hundreds of them, thousands. But which was which? When? She doesn't know anymore. Has too many memories competing for the same mental space. So she starts losing her own history. Not to death or decay, but to sheer volume. And that's its own kind of death, the death of self. When you can't remember who you were, what are you? Floette would have had to reconstruct herself over and over, decide who she was based on incomplete memories and the unchanging truth of what she carried. The eternal flower never changed. Light of ruin was always there. The immortality was constant. Identity built not on history but on trauma, on the unchanging fact of her curse. That's what immortality does to you eventually. It strips away everything except the core wound. And for Floette, that core wound was simple. She was brought back wrong. Everything else blurred and faded, but that central truth remained. Sharp, clear, undeniable. She shouldn't exist, but she does, and she can't stop existing. The years would have brought changes in human civilization that Floette observed but could never participate in. The development of Pokeball technology, the formalization of Pokemon training, the establishment of Pokemon leagues, the gradual shift from viewing Pokemon as tools to viewing them as partners. She'd see all of this happening, watch as the relationship between humans and Pokemon transformed into something healthier. And she'd think about the war, about how if this understanding had existed 3,000 years ago, maybe she wouldn't have died. Maybe AZ wouldn't have built the weapon. Maybe none of this would have happened. But it did happen, and she has to live with the consequences while the world moves on, learns its lessons, becomes better. She's stuck carrying the price of the past while everyone else gets to benefit from the present. There would have been moments of beauty too. Not many, but some. Times when Floette found a particularly perfect garden, or witnessed a sunset that, even after seeing thousands, still managed to move her, or helped a Pokemon in a way that felt meaningful. Those moments wouldn't erase the suffering, but they'd be something. Small points of light in an otherwise dark existence. A flower blooming at exactly the right moment, the perfect shade, the perfect shape. Floette would tend it, draw out its power, help it reach its full potential. And for that moment, she'd remember why she loved flowers in the first place. It wouldn't last. The flower would die eventually, and Floette would outlive it by millennia. But in that moment, it was perfect. And she got to be part of that perfection. Those moments were probably what kept her sane. If she's sane, hard to say. What does sanity mean for a being who's lived 3,000 years in isolation? What's the baseline for normal when your existence is fundamentally abnormal? She could be hallucinating half the things she experiences and wouldn't know. Could have constructed elaborate fantasies to make the loneliness bearable. Could have developed any number of coping mechanisms that would look like madness from the outside, but are actually the only thing keeping her functional from the inside. And nobody would ever know, because nobody's watching, nobody's checking in. She's on her own, completely, the most isolated being in the world, and she handles it somehow, through whatever combination of strength, stubbornness, dissociation, or adaptation that an immortal flower Pokemon can muster. The development of modern Kalos would have been both fascinating and painful to watch. Lumiose City growing from whatever it was into the sprawling metropolis it became. The Prism Tower being built, and did she think about AZ while watching it? This tower reaching toward the heavens in a way that might have reminded her of the ultimate weapon? Different purposes, but maybe it echoed for her. Maybe that made her avoid Lumiose for centuries, stay away from the heart of modern Kalos, because it reminded her too much of ancient Kalos, of the war, of the weapon. The seasons would have lost meaning. Spring, summer, fall, winter. They'd blur together. She'd seen 3,000 springs, 3,000 winters. At first, each season would have been precious. Eventually, they'd just become noise. And the places, Floette would have memories of Kalos when it was a very different region, before most of the current infrastructure existed. She'd remember forests that were now cities, rivers that had changed course, mountains that had eroded. Every time she returned somewhere, it would be like looking at a familiar face that had been completely reconstructed. Nowhere would feel like home, because home doesn't exist when you outlive everything. Did she ever encounter AZ during those 3,000 years? They were both wandering the same world, both cursed with the same endless existence. In all that time, did their paths ever cross? Maybe. Maybe they'd see each other from a distance. AZ, towering and unmistakable, and Floette would hide, or flee, or simply watch from afar, seeing what time had done to him, seeing him grow older, more worn, more hollow. Did she feel pity, anger, both? When you've been alive for centuries, emotions become complicated. But she never approached, never spoke to him, just observed sometimes from a safe distance, and then moved on. Because forgiveness wasn't something she could give. Not yet, maybe not ever. But worse than encountering AZ would be encountering other Pokemon who'd been part of the war. Not immortals, but descendants. And Floette would know. She'd be able to tell. You see a Steelix and think, your ancestor might have been chained to one of those stones. You see a Salamence and wonder, did your great-great-grandparent die to fuel my resurrection? Every Pokemon she met was potentially connected to her trauma, and they wouldn't know. They'd just see a Floette. They'd have no idea they were talking to a living graveyard. How do you form genuine connections when you're carrying that kind of secret? You don't. You can't. So you stay alone. But over 3,000 years, even anger gets tired. Even the most justified resentment eventually loses its edge. Not because you've forgiven, but because holding on to strong emotions for that long is exhausting. Emotions are meant to be temporary. So by the time AZ finally changed, finally became someone who could smile again, Floette's anger had faded into something else, resignation, or just a kind of tired acceptance. She'd spent 3,000 years being angry, and it hadn't helped, hadn't changed anything. It had just been there. But when she felt AZ change, when she sensed that shift in him, maybe she realized that she could change too. Not physically, but emotionally, spiritually. She could let go. Not forgive, necessarily, but release. Stop carrying the anger as a central part of her identity. That's what brought her back. Not love, not forgiveness, not even hope, just tiredness. A decision that being angry for another 3,000 years sounded even more unbearable than the alternative. And the alternative was acknowledgement, connection, saying, yes, you hurt me. Yes, what you did was terrible. Yes, I've suffered for 3,000 years because of your choices. But I've also been alone for 3,000 years, and I'm tired of being alone. So here I am, not because everything's okay, but because nothing's okay, and at least you understand that. That's what the reunion really meant. Not reconciliation in any traditional sense, but recognition. Two broken beings looking at each other and seeing their own brokenness reflected back. And maybe that's all healing ever is when the wound is too deep to close. Just finding someone else with the same wound and sitting with them and acknowledging that yes, this hurts. Yes, it's always hurt. Yes, it'll probably always hurt. But at least you're not alone with it anymore. Floette is still immortal, still can't evolve, still carries light of ruin inside her. She's still fundamentally wrong, still outside the natural cycle, still suffering. But she's not alone anymore. And after 3,000 years of solitude, that's not nothing. It's not enough. It doesn't fix anything. But it's something. And when you're immortal, sometimes something's all you can hope for. So there's Floette, the eternal flower, the dark fairy tale, the tragedy that walks, the weapon disguised as a Pokemon. She'll keep existing. Keep carrying her burden. Keep being this impossible thing because she doesn't have a choice. And maybe, now that she's with AZ again, the existence will be slightly less unbearable. Not good, never good, but bearable. They're together now, the two immortals of Kalos. Both broken, both carrying guilt and grief and loneliness so deep, it's become structural. And they'll continue, together, until AZ finally dies and Floette is alone again. Truly alone, the last remnant, the final witness. But that's a tragedy for another day. For now, in this moment, she has something resembling companionship. Someone who knows. Someone who understands. And maybe that's the closest thing to grace that immortality can offer. Recognition. Witness. Someone who knows. It's not much. It's not enough. It'll never be enough. But it's something. And after 3,000 years of nothing, something feels like everything.